There's a pretty common pawn structure in chess called the isolated queen's pawn, and this arises from several different openings, actually. And I remember when I was a beginner, I was always told an isolated pawn is bad, right? Well, that is mostly true, but it sort of depends on the situation, actually. And if you don't know how to play correctly against an isolated pawn, then the player with the isolated pawn can actually use it somewhat to their advantage. So I played a game pretty recently, which ended up in an isolated queen's pawn position, and I did not play it correctly. I knew some of the things that I was supposed to do, but the way this game went, it was pretty instructional and helped me to learn some of the guidelines for playing against playing in this kind of position, and I wanted to share some of those with you today. And so let's dive in. I started off the game, I was playing with the white pieces, and I started the game with d4. Playing against an online opponent, pretty highly rated. I knew this was going to be a challenging one, but yeah, so started with d4, d5. I've been learning to play the Catalan. I'm not amazing at it yet. There's going to be a video on that coming up pretty soon, once I get a little more experience. But I tried to go into sort of a Catalan type of setup with the fianchetto. So far, so good. And then they played c5, which I typically would meet with c4, which, you know, I want to play c4 anyway. And then basically we've transposed into a Tarrasch defense, like a Queen's Gambit declined Tarrasch with this little square of pawns in the middle of the board. So not really a Catalan, but that's okay. I know kind of the basics of how to play against the Tarrasch defense. So first of all, I trade the pawns here and then castle and bring my knight out. And one of the things with the Tarrasch is eventually you want to trade here and isolate this pawn and then kind of play against it, like maybe bring the bishop out, trade the knight to remove the defense of the isolated pawn and so on. For any of you players who play against the Tarrasch or play the Tarrasch as black more often, you probably know a whole lot more about this than I do. But I'm just kind of getting back into d4 and learning some of these ideas. So that's kind of what I was going for. I wanted to eventually isolate this pawn and then win it. So black actually traded here instead of me trading off in this case, which I felt like was pretty good for me as white because it allows me to get my knight a little more active rather than allowing the bishop to get more active. And they castle. And so now we're in an isolated queen's pawn position. This d pawn for black is isolated. And as I mentioned, I kind of wanted to work on putting pressure on this pawn and capturing it as soon as possible. I want to bring the bishop. I want to trade it off here. And I already have, you know, my bishop and knight both attacking. And then if this knight wasn't here, then I would also have the queen attacking. I can get rid of this defender. And you know, it's a little bit tricky because like this bishop can come in and can defend. Maybe the queen can come up and the rook can also defend. But that's kind of what my game plan is. I want to put as much pressure on this as possible. But in the end, it didn't end up being quite the right plan. Like it's sort of on the right track, but black can defend. And then when black defends, I need to know what to do at that point. Like if my only game plan is to try to capture this pawn and then black adequately defends and I can't capture it, then what, right? So against an isolated queen's pawn like this, there are a few things that you want to do, as I read up on this quite a bit after finishing the game. First of all, and the thing I did know about, is you want to prevent this pawn from advancing. You want to blockade it, for example, with a knight, like I'm doing right now, which is quite nice. Or you want to control the square in front of the pawn. So even if I didn't have that knight there, and that knight is going to move in just a second, you want to control it, maybe with a pawn, maybe with a bishop, maybe with a knight from here or from here, and basically prevent that pawn from moving down the board. And then you want to, and this is something that I learned, the thing with an isolated pawn is it gives a lot of like open lines and space to the player that has the isolated pawn. And so what they want to do is they want to launch an attack. They want to play really actively and launch some kind of attack that is going to win material or attack your king or something like that. On the other hand, the side playing against it, so in this case me as white, wants to, along with blockading it, wants to actually trade off pieces. So we want to get rid of a bunch of minor pieces and kind of push the game toward an end game, because in an end game, the isolated pawn is particularly weak. It can't be defended by any other pawns, right? Because it's isolated. And so it can only be defended by pieces. And if we trade off more of the pieces, it becomes harder for the opponent to defend the pawn. The other thing we can do is we can put a lot of pressure on that pawn and cause, in this case, black's pieces to be kind of tied down to defending it. Like the bishop has to be here defending, the knight has to be here, maybe the queen and maybe a rook. And then when all the pieces are tied down, we might have a little more freedom to launch an attack of our own, like maybe somehow launch an attack against the king. I'm not sure if that's exactly what to do in this sort of position, but that's another idea to consider and to think about. So those are kind of the guidelines, and unfortunately, I didn't really know this during the game, and so I actually moved the knight out here, which isn't really the right idea. It's kind of removing the blockade, and I mean, so the idea, what I was trying to do was open up this attack from my queen, and what I'm trying to do is basically I'm desperately trying to win that pawn, which is, you know, again, it's kind of the right idea, but not entirely, because black can just easily defend. And then I go here anyway, thinking like, okay, I can threaten to trade, and then, you know, I'm going to have enough attackers to get that pawn, but not really, because once I trade, the black bishop ends up on f6, and now I have some weaknesses along here that I have to deal with. And actually, there are some lines where I end up losing this knight and having my pawns separated, so I have an isolated pawn of my own. There are some lines where this knight moves, but then this pawn gets taken, so I win this one, but I lose this one, and it just doesn't quite work out. It turns out the best engine move here is actually bishop e3. This was actually back a little bit further. Before I even moved the knight, the best move was bishop e3. And it was a good move a little bit later as well, and I'll show you that. It looks really silly because I'm putting the bishop in front of my e-pawn, which in Catalan type structures, sometimes you want to push this e-pawn. But in this structure, actually, this bishop move is nice because it adds a defender to this square. And so even if this knight moves, there's just yet another piece controlling the d4 square. That's the square that is in front of the isolated pawn. So instead, as I mentioned, I moved the knight, and then I brought my bishop here, again looking to trade off. But of course, black called my bluff and said, like, all right, go ahead and trade that knight. It's just going to make my bishop better. So I decided not to. And once again, it actually would have been pretty good to bring the bishop back to e3 and just cover this d4 square, preventing the pawn from ever moving forward. Another good move, actually, let's see. Yeah, so the engine says that it's still actually good to just trade here. It does make this bishop more powerful, but I can do something about that. I can move the queen over or something. I'm not sure. But again, as the side playing against the isolated queen's pawn, we actually want to trade off pieces. And so this serves to start trading off pieces and get closer to an endgame. So I didn't do that. I played this move, which seemed pretty sensible, and it's not terrible, but it's just the wrong idea. It does, you know, put this bishop on a nice active diagonal, but it's not playing correctly against this isolated pawn. Queen d7, knight d4. I wasn't really sure what to do, and I was regretting moving my knight away from that blockade. I think there was a tactic that I thought I was going to get by doing that, and of course it didn't work, like with the bishop defending, and I can't draw arrows, and not being able to trade off this knight and so on. So I thought, okay, let's start playing against an isolated pawn rather than just trying to capture that pawn right away and make sure that it's blockaded. But it was almost a little bit too late. So now with the queen lined up with the bishop, they're going to trade off my strong bishop, which I was not okay with during the game, but I should have been, because again, I want to trade down to an endgame so that this pawn becomes even weaker. And I ended up playing rook e1 because I was thinking, well, if I can't win that pawn, maybe I can just break and open things up in the center, right? That is not the arrow. Open things up in the center, perhaps would be the right plan of action. It wasn't, but that was kind of my train of thought. Here, I think the best move is actually just rook c1. the C file is open, so let's put a rook there, right? Just improve my position a little bit. So I played rook e1, we traded here, and then both of us actually put rooks on the open C file. And then black captured here. Now, if my bishop had been on e3, then I could have captured with the bishop and continued sort of this blockade, which would have been quite nice. But I had to capture with my queen instead, and then bishop c5 kind of pushes my queen back, and then finally black gets to actually push this pawn forward. And so it's a little bit worse. Like, I think the engine is still kind of like, you know, you're fine. It doesn't make that big of a difference, but this is kind of something that you don't want to allow in these sorts of positions, in my understanding anyway. I'm sure it depends a lot on the different types of positions, but generally I felt like this was getting worse for me, especially since this knight doesn't have a lot of places it can go. So I just moved here, we traded, and then my queen was attacked, and then I moved the queen to f3. I wanted to maintain some level of pressure here, and I'm still sort of covering this this d3 square to block the pawn. Probably moving the queen to d3 would have been a little bit better. The engine says that they're both about the same. But one thing that this allows is this move, queen b5, which surprised me a little bit, actually. And this is where I kind of started losing the thread a little bit. Of course, the queen is attacking my b-pawn, and I don't have a really nice way of defending it. Like, I could do something like queen b3, but then, you know, after trades, then I'm going to have doubled isolated pawns, which is not very nice. I don't want to add that sort of weakness. It turns out the best move was b3, and I did consider b3. b3 looks really obvious, but I was worried that then the queen could simply attack my a pawn, and then after moving the a pawn up, the queen could just attack my b pawn again. And I didn't want to have to like move a rook behind it or whatever. What I didn't see from a distance is that the queen is actually defending the b pawn on b3, and so this is basically fine. I mean, this pawn is still backwards, and there's potentially an issue that I have to keep my eyes on, but this would have been a lot better. Instead, I decided to go for this idea where I move the rook up, which defends the pawn, and I realized that the problem with this was the d3 push, which would be attacking the rook. And from this position, I decided that was okay because I could push here, I could put the rook here, they would push, and then I could put my rook here. And the idea is afterward, I could put this rook here and continue putting some pressure on that pawn. So I felt like I was going to be fine. What I missed from a distance is once this rook ends up here, then it is on a diagonal with my other rook that can be skewered by this bishop. And that's exactly what happened. So they pushed, I put my rook here, and we got a skewer. And now the game is basically over. I did play it out, not all the way till checkmate, but I played it out a little bit longer. I tried to figure out a way here that I could get away with just going down in exchange, but actually it's not so easy, and I ended up losing quite a lot of material and pretty quickly losing the game. So the reason I lost the game in the end was because of this blunder, but I also, in a large part, it was because I played incorrectly against this isolated queen's pawn, and it was allowed to just keep pushing down the board and causing problems and giving black a lot of activity. And so I think for me, the big lesson in this game really is kind of what to do about this pawn. I want to just move back to, yeah, kind of this starting position where we have the isolated queen's pawn, and this is the place to start thinking about how to play against this. And just to recap, the side with the isolated pawn, so black in this case, wants to use their open lines, their extra activity to start an attack, to play actively and launch an attack. What we want to do as the side playing against this pawn is we want to trade down into an endgame, because then the attack will kind of lose its steam, and this pawn will actually become much weaker, much more of a target. And then the other option is we just tie up all of the pieces defending, which I kind of did in this game, to be fair. Sort of. I mean, this piece had to defend, this piece had to defend, the queen was sort of defending. But then finding a way to use the fact that all of the pieces are tied up to then play actively and launch some kind of attack that the side with the isolated pawn can't easily defend against. So those are some sort of guidelines that I have learned, and I'm sure I'm going to learn more as I play more into these types of positions. But I hope this was helpful for you. So definitely hit that like button if you enjoyed this video and if you found it interesting or useful, or you learned something. And also, as I mentioned, ultimately, the reason I lost this game was because of a blunder. And a lot of the time, these blunders happen because I'm surprised by something, or I'm kind of rattled or taken off balance or something like that. And I actually shot a video about these sorts of mistakes that you can check out right over here if you're interested. And I will see you on the next one.